prossima presentazione che faccio in italiano perché Bogdan capisce benissimo l'italiano, diciamo, è un frequentatore assiduo di iniziative archivistiche nel nostro paese, in particolare a Trieste, della scuola, l'iniziativa Il Convegno è la scuola che si tiene ogni anno a Trieste. Quindi do allora la parola a Bogdan Popovici dell'Archivio Nazionale rumeno, che ci parlerà di RiC-CM and the Record Management. Grazie.
Buongiorno cari colleghi. And my Italian stop here. Just try to be understandable by everybody and by myself also. Thank you for the opportunity for being here, and I must say I have a special feeling about this due to the fact that our archival science in Romania is deeply influenced, or was deeply influenced at its modern beginnings, by the Italian archival science, by the manual written by Eugenio Casanova. So basically I have a feeling of coming as a child coming to the parents, so which is quite relaxing and quite, I don't know, frightening sometimes for a punishment. Thank you for the opportunity of being here again, and I hope to keep my emotions for me. So this will be the agenda. I'll try to be as short as possible, also because of the food issue. So the agenda would be, first of all, I felt the need to give some introductory remarks. Then we shall talk a bit about the potential use of RiC for the records management. Then about digital preservation and brief conclusions afterwards. Talking at the beginning about some common roots the Romanian and Italian archival science have, I'm very pleased that for the first time in a long line of presentations, I don't need to hide myself between the terms in English. So yes, I know, and I'm going to use the archives as being the umbrella for everything from the creation to historical, as would be the continuum, Archivio corrente, Archivio di deposito, Archivio storico, not saying like in English the archives is only the historical part. I also know that you and us, we all have documented Archivio and not records. So the record will be documented and we all be happy. Also I know we have gestione di documenti correnti e intermediari and no records management because we don't have records. But we keep the words, sometimes in English, but I think we all know that we're talking about these documents, these archives in a very large sense. Another point I want to emphasize is about the status of RiC. I was joking with my colleagues that if we would be very diligent enough to prepare our presentation since a week ago, probably they would look differently after 3 days of debates. So it is very important for everybody to take into account that RiC is still fluid in many aspects. So basically the presentation today in some elements might be different than facts that will be after several months or 1-2 years in the future. Another element about the status of RiC, basically it refers to the historical archives. So records management, the topic of my presentation, is rather an extension of RiC, a potential use of RiC, which was designed purposely only for historic archives. Because my colleagues were talking about what is RiC, I want to emphasize 2 things about what is not RiC. It's not a standard like ICAR to apply it as such, so it has a certain degree of theoretical approach. It is like, I'm thinking, which would be the better comparison, probably it is like my wife doing my shopping list and saying we want meat and we want vegetables, not specifying what kind of meat and what kind of vegetables. So it's sort of theoretical thing, and for details we need to think more truly and more careful. And another element, not being a records management standard, we should not look at him as being fully applicable in the records management world in Gestione di Archivio Ponente. I would not like to make the same mistake as before, or not necessarily mistake, but not to express a hopefully thinking. These were the expectations when ICG was presented. So it was expected to be used for the records management also, but as far as I know, it was not the case. So try to integrate with the other things, but keep the focus on what was meant to be. For the records management, as you know, in fact, there are many standards. You have here the ISO standards, or the family, as they were presented by Barbara in Seoul last year. But the main question that may arise out of this is that if there are so many standards and if they are so good, why parochial practices still exists? And my response to that would be that they are not generally and always so universal applicable as expected. There are still particularities in various countries, there are still various traditions, and standards not always being as, let's say, free of various backgrounds or various traditional backgrounds, may give certain way of thinking which are not necessarily shared by everybody. So what would be the records management functions that RiC may contribute to? I was thinking first to say, identify the responsibilities for records and individualize or characterize the entities involved. And here would be broadly representation. I remember many colleagues saying we don't care about functions, we don't care about creators because we are records managers and we deal only with records. And that was okay until I questioned them. If you don't need structure of the organization or if you don't need functions, how are you going to create your classification plan? Because you don't have a list of records in the classification plan. You have a structure, so you need to take some other entities into account. A second function for the records management would be to take control, maintain, and support the use of records. Generally, we know, and traditionally we say that records accumulation are organic, and they may be organic, at least until the moment when this organicity mess up everything, and we need to implement some tools to really control the records and to know where somebody put them before I was trying to reach them and I couldn't find them. A third element would be, a third function would be to prepare transfer of records or act as archivists for long-term or permanent records. We can think that we might have in records management area very wonderful systems, a perfect MOREC 2010 compatible system, but when they try to export and transfer these electronic records to the archives, this will be done on some DVDs because the archivist has nothing and they keep those DVDs somewhere on the shelf, and that will be over with the wonderful MOREC system compliant. Good, so what about RiC? First of all, I think that RiC has a more agnostic model of archival world. My colleagues gave you the presentation about various entities that exist, and I'd like to emphasize only some of them. For instance, many times archives world, the archives, the historical archives is presenting as dealing only with aggregation of records. That would be, in many cases, a problem with the records manager, which starts from the registration of the document of the record. That meaning they deal also with discrete elements. RiC is embracing both approaches. I mean, we have the entities for record, which has its own particularities, and also the record set, which embraces which has other particularities. And as Daniel Pitti said in this morning, we should not confound the two, because there are various elements which are specific to each other. And I will only recall you a common thing. I love this example very much. When we are describing in the archives the span dates of a file, we are generally referring to the span dates of the records inside, but not to the date when the file was created and when the file was assembled and closed. In some circumstances, these differences might be relevant. So it's obvious there is no similarities in description for all the elements. For records management, I would also like to emphasize that aspect of documentary form. As you may know, in many implementations, especially the IT guys, love this documentary form very much, or the record type, because they are using them to control the content of the information, and also unhappy, we would say, for the disposition, which is not a happy thing, but they are trying to do it and try to implement it. So this is an entity very important for the records management. We have it distinctly, at least until now, in RiC also. Another field where the RiC may contribute to the records management is with its deeper analysis of the significant attributes of the entities. One may instinctively take a sheet of paper and say something about it in order to describe it and say, look, this is the description of this record. This is what happens often in secretariats, in various institutions, and they say, well, we are do the job of the archivist or the records manager, we are describing it. Well, if you make a step behind and have a deeper look and try to figure it out, the bigger picture, you may see that there are some details that may be captured, not as visible and not so relevant from the first sight. And I think the more structured perspectives over the characteristics of records that are presented in RiC is helpful for maybe helpful for the records managers. And just to give you a brief example, we have especially paid attention and revealed a characteristic about, an attribute about the technical characteristics specific to the delegate agent. That would mean we must keep into account, for instance, an ATM at the bank that delivers money. It's not the man as an agent to create the record, it is a machine that creates the record. And these technical characteristics of that machine may have some influence over the quality and the parameters of the record that is created. That would be the earthly example. The more heavenly example would be not necessarily a spaceship, but a space robot sent to the Mars and taking various pictures and everything over there. Maybe some technical problem may affect the quality of the record that is created by that machine. So I think it is an example how the technical devices today may influence the creation of the record, and this is a dimension that should be taken into account when characterize the records. Bottom line, RiC could help to identify entities of interest, would allow to establish metadata of interest, and what is more important overall, would enhance the cooperation between records managers and archives managers, between the records managers themselves and the archivists. And why is that? Maybe you're thinking to the electronic records, and this is a fact. You may have wonderful systems, but you need to implement some archival records control that would be responsible on long term of the quality of records in the archives. But this is also can be the case for paper archives. And I am thinking the fact that in some jurisdictions, French, I don't know what is the Italian practice, but in some jurisdictions, the elements that describe a file within the records management area are relevant on long term and may be imposed by the regulation or I don't know what, but that regulation itself is created by the professionals that must be aware which elements are necessary on short or long term in order to manage the record properly. Another field where another direction of interaction between records management and RiC would be a better contextualization, creating what was presented as a multidimensional reality. As it was said, for many times the models in description of record, either in records management or archives management, presented the record as a static object. This is what the record is, full stop. But this is rather an assertion and an assertion at a given moment. In fact, we know from our, if not from our experience directly, but professional experience, but from our administrative experience, that a record may be now in this file, tomorrow may be in another file, or maybe at all, which is not desirable. That means, in a very basic example, that the record's life and the record's existence is dynamic, and it may receive new values in time. Until now, very few standards expressed and tried to capture this reality, and even fewer tried to transmit this reality of records management to the body of records for historical preservation. RiC is engaged in this approach, support this approach, and create the necessary elements in order to preserve and to receive, first of all, from the records management area, and to preserve on time whole complexity range of relationships, whole range of events in the life of the record, or at least this is the intention. We may have to hammer it a bit on this. So we want to let aside the static view of the record, promote dynamic view, and collect as much information about this. If the records manager had this in their systems, because the daily life would impose that to them, it was impossible for them until now to transfer them to the archives, as we shall see a little bit in the future. Another element that may be considered a summary of what I was saying until now, is that RiC tries to offer better compatibility with most complex records management standards today. In many countries and in various jurisdictions, unfortunately, the two professions are split and they develop separately. So they develop tools and methodologies separate from the archival ones. Basically, it will be a problem when they try to communicate with the records from the first phases to the historical phase of their lives. Trying to align RiC with records management standard would be an important step before in trying to align the interests, methodologies, and tools for making the life of records as smooth as possible. So, summarizing, RiC may help for having an easy transfer from the previous phases to historical archives, and will allow for the persistence and reuse of records management metadata. What was gathered in the current stage and the intermediate stage of life can be reused in the archives. And in order to show you it's not just a figure of speech, you have some elements, some metadata from the metadata schema of MOREC, and it's just a long question to discover where to put those metadata in ICG, as using the tool that exists today. Good. What about digital long-term preservation? Of course, you are familiar with this. Image is the general perspective over the preservation, the model OIS. And in my view, the place where RiC may contribute are at the level of information packages, the first phase, the first line of interest. Why is that? You may also be interested, you may also be familiar with this picture, which is a more detailed presentation of what information package is. And basically what we have in an information package, we have the object themselves, the digital object itself, and description information about the object, all encapsulated in one package. Currently, the information about provenance, about content, about fixity, and so on, are coded in various standards, most often in EAD or EC. But sometimes this EAD and ESC are not the standard EAD and ESC because many consider there are not enough elements for their needs. So they expand the elements existent, which raise some questions if this indeed EAD or ESC inside. With the development of RiC, we may expect that we can offer a new framework for type of information, place information, elements, metadata, and so on, that may be and should be included in this descriptive elements from information packages. And last but not least, another place where the organization contribute is at the data management level. As you may be aware, there are many projects about digital preservation all around the world. And the most fascinating thing for me is that almost all of them treat the digital preservation as being a complete separate thing that the archival management itself. That is, from those projects' approach, when you receive a CD attached to a letter, you put the letter in a file and the CD is somewhere else. Yeah, because they are electronic, the other one are paper. I don't share this approach. And I truly believe the record is a record because of its inner characteristic of being an evidence of a certain transaction. That means if we shall have records in an archive, paper and electronic, we should manage it in a common way. We should have a common infrastructure to manage the descriptive information over hybrid archives. And that would mean this model which stays somehow below, and above it we will have a data management for the records no matter what. And that implies that we need to be very careful in developing RiC elements. Already happened, but as you saw, it needs more hammering. We need to be very more careful to how to describe the electronic records and align the description with paper records also. Try to see the elements necessary and use them according to the material, but not in separate systems, because it's a management, should be an integrated management for records. Good. What would be the conclusions now? Though, as I said at the beginning, RiC is not specifically dedicated to records management, it may influence the way records management understand and structure, or the records managers understand and structure their methods and practices. RiC allows for a better integration between the first phases of life of records and the historical archives in systems and practices, and aim to a richer collected use of metadata regarding records and their contexts. Not in the end of this, RiC helps describing hybrid archives, revealing the identity of contexts and purposes for the records, for creation, maintaining, and use of them. Grazie per l'attenzione.
Very much also, Bogdan, for being really on time.